the Rector of the University, is giving an interview to join us shortly. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our second conference on Islamophobia. We will talk about the conference later, inshallah, giving more information. But this is the opening session. We're very pleased and honored and privileged to have all of you with us on this very important topic. In the opening session, Dr. Fatimah Bint Abdullah will be the session chair, so she will introduce the different speakers. Meanwhile, I will introduce her. Dr. Abdullah received her first degree in Usul al-Din and philosophy from National University in Malaysia in 1981. She obtained her Master's of Philosophy from St. Andrew University in Scotland in 1991 and her PhD in Islamic Thought and Civilization from Malaysia in 1998. In 2007, she received a diploma in Social Sciences from International Islamic University in Malaysia, where she's from originally, and had taught at the International Islamic University for more than 20 years. She also taught at Ahfad University for Women in Sudan, and currently she is with the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, our center. We're very pleased to have you. And an associate professor at Sabah al-Din Zain University. She's published several articles and books in various aspects of Islamic thought, including a text on Islamic Aqidah and issues on Usul al-Din and Islamic ethics and character building. Please welcome with me Dr. Fatimah Bint Abdullah.
Thank you, Professor Sami. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Honorable Director General of Research Center for Islamic History, Arts and Culture, CIGA, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, Professor Dr. Ali Zaran, Director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, Professor Dr. Sami Al-Arian, invited guests, paper presenters, professors and students. Welcome to the second International Conference on Islamophobia organized by the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. Honorable Rector of Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, Professor Dr. Mehmet bulut. Let's give him 1 minute. Okay. In this auspicious occasion, I would like to invite Director of Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, Professor Dr. Mehmet bulut, Professor of Economic History, to deliver his welcoming remark. But before that, I would like to read his long CV, but I make it short, inshallah. Mehmet bulut is the Rector of Istanbul Zaim University, as well as a Professor of Economics and Economic History. He got his master degree and PhD from abroad, and he's teaching for many years, and now he is, before that he became Dean of the College of Political Sciences and Vice President of Yildirim Bayezid University in 2011, and served as a member of the Turkish Academy of Sciences, TUBA, in 2012. He has also served as a member of the board of directors of several public and private companies. Professor Dr. bulut has many publications in Rector Journal. Please welcome Professor Dr. Mehmet bulut.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Dear distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, faculty, students, visitors, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to welcome to all to the second international conference on Islamophobia here at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. I want to begin by thanking the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for helping organize this very important and timely conference. I extend my deepest gratitude to the Center's Director, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, and to the CIGA staff for their dedication, diligence, and excellent organization. Last April, we hosted the inaugural conference on Islamophobia, when internationally renowned scholars from all corners of the world joined us to examine Islamophobia's impact on culture and global politics. Divided into 6 sessions over the course of 3 days, more than 2,000 speakers delivered papers on a variety of social, political, economic, epistemological, and normative issues as they pertain to the even more relevant phenomenon of Islamophobia. We are proud to have some of these scholars with us again this year and are delighted to welcome a number of new scholars to continue this critical conversation. This year's conference will focus more intently on the discourses and geopolitics of Islamophobia. As Muslims all around the world continue to bear the burdens of Islamophobia, it's not only incumbent on us as thinkers, researchers, and scholars to understand, express, and outline its discursive and geopolitical dimensions, but also identify some of the potential ways by which community and world leaders can begin to advance solutions. Indeed, the dire nature of Islamophobia cannot be overstated today. In Myanmar, the native Rohingya have been brutalized, killed, and expelled for their Muslim faith. In India, Islamophobia has taken an ugly turn in Kashmir and other states where Hindu nationalists have been turning peaceful coexistence into polarized communities. Under the hands of Chinese government, Uyghur Muslims are similarly being subjected to industrial-scale persecution. In Europe and North America, Muslims often find themselves the victims of government surveillance, media pressure, and are otherwise forced to live in fear that they might soon face a fate similar to those in Quebec, Canada, or more recently of those in Christchurch, New Zealand. And in this region, too many Muslims frequently experience the consequences of Islamophobia. In Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example, mosques are regularly surveilled, and the acceptable parameters of what is and is not Islam lies largely in the destructive hands of these states. In cases where scholars and preachers have spoken or written outside of these parameters, they have been met with harassment, imprisonment, or worse. Despite the visible concern, many leaders and public figures have, for these breaches of basic human rights, and despite the dangerous implications of Islamophobia on peace and democracy, very little has been done to address these many problems head-on. It is unsurprising then that Muslims around the world should feel at once both intimidated and helpless. Wherever they may be in the world, Muslims are often socially, politically, and even intellectually disabled due to the pressures and dangers of Islamophobia on their lives. To live a life of freedom, dignity, and peace is the desire of every human being, wherever they may exist around the world. Islamophobia threatens these human rights in grave and unquestionable ways. During last year's conference on the Muslim Ummah in October here at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, I concluded my opening remarks by asking how we, as concerned citizens of the world, can build a future in which the desires for freedom, dignity, and peace become sustainable rights for everyone, regardless of faith, ethnicity, nationality, gender, language, or culture. A world in which we reorient the discussion from out to is. I again pose this urgent question here today in the hope that these next 3 days might help pave the way further in the long yet necessary path toward an answer. We are truly privileged to have among us a world-class range of thinkers who will address our students and help us navigate through a wide variety of problems on the question of Islamophobia. May the discussions and ideas we share at this conference be fruitful and beneficial to the students, scholars, researchers, leaders, and citizens of conscience alike. We at ISU are proud to host this important conference. May God bless you and all your efforts. At the end of my speech, I would like to thank to all contributors, to all participants from all of the world, and especially to the organizers of this conference, to the team of Sami Al-Arian and his students, and to all our guests from Turkey or from abroad. You're welcome, and I hope a successful conference in the following days. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rector, for the thoughtful speech. May Allah bless you. For the next speech, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Al-Arian, Director General of Research Center for Islamic History, Arts and Culture, CIGA, of Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, to deliver his speech. Professor Dr. Al-Arian graduated from Faculty of Islamic Studies at Marmara University, Istanbul in 1976. He received his master's degree from the Department of History, Marmara University in 1989, and doctorate degree from Institute of Turkish Studies at the same university in 1995. In January 2014, he became an associate professor in the field of social humanities and sciences. Professor Dr. Al-Arian joined the Research Center for Islamic History, Arts and Culture of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, CIGA, in 1981 as a senior researcher and head of the Library and Documentation Department. A few years later, he was assigned to the post of Deputy Director General while carrying on him his other duties. He was appointed as General Director of CIGA in January 2005 and is currently working in this capacity. Please welcome Dr. Al-Arian.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Elhamdülillahi Rabbil alemin. Salatu ve selamu ala seyyidina Muhammedin ve ala alihi ve sahbihi ecmaîn. Honorable Rector of Sabahattin Zaim University, Professor Dr. Mehmet Bulut, distinguished scholars and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am honored to address this important conference convened to deal with the ever-pressing problem of Islamophobia. Our conference represents a committed effort to reiterate our deep concern in the face of the alarming problem and reactivate urgent reflection on how to tackle it. We are assembling after the terrible terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in New Zealand, which show once more that hostility towards Islam results in mass killings and pre-planned massacre. While political and religious leaders and world community strongly condemn the act, it is deplorable that part of world press is still reluctant to term it a terrorist attack. Analysis of anti-Muslim hatred and its diverse manifestations show that it is a deep-rooted phenomenon with historical origins. In our century, it has been deliberately fueled by ill-intentioned parties through hate speech and hate activities. It entrenched itself in Europe and elsewhere in political discourse to manipulate public opinion. It established itself in administrative praxis, reaching up to human rights violations. It also expresses itself in everyday social life in outrage, aggression against Muslims and their cultural heritage properties. Islamophobia is a threat not only to Muslims but to the whole world, but world community remains unable to eliminate it. States and international organizations adopted anti-defamatory legislation and measures to counter extremism. The United Nations Human Rights Council Resolution 16/18, titled Combating Intolerance, Negative Stereotyping, and Stigmatization of and Discrimination, Incitement of Violence, and Violence Against Persons Based on Religion and Belief, was adopted in 2011. UNESCO adopted the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity in 2005. Such legislative and documentary instruments simply request countries to take the necessary precautions to prevent people from being exposed to violence and discrimination because of their religion or belief. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation (OIC) and its Cultural and Civilization Center (CIGA), as a representative of the Muslim world in global platforms, are directly concerned and involved with the problem. Islamophobia is a permanent item on the OIC agenda. The 13th Islamic Summit Conference under the chairmanship of His Excellency Recep Tayyip Erdogan underscored the problems comprehensively in its final declaration and its pertinent resolutions. The 46th session of the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers took resolutions calling upon all states to take serious measures to combat Islamophobia. All possible steps are taken by OIC and IRSICA in all international forums. The Islamophobia Observatory, active at the OIC General Secretariat, analyzes and publishes data on Islamophobic acts of all types in all continents. The last report of the OIC Islamophobia Observatory for the period from June 2018 to February 2019, even before the New Zealand massacre, states that Islamophobia trend worldwide during the reviewed period has reached an alarming level, hence requires immediate actions at international and national levels. Collective and worldwide endeavor to combat Islamophobia is expected to minimize its negative impacts on social life based on tolerance and peaceful coexistence. IRCICA, as the OIC's cultural center, is concerned with the problem within the framework of various projects related to interfaith relations, multiculturalism, combating extremism and terrorism, disseminating peace, culture, and promoting peace education, among others. Two of our conferences addressed Islamophobia directly. The OIC Expert Group Workshop for evaluating the first decade of the OIC Islamophobia Observatory, coordinated by the OIC and IRCICA in April 2017. And the Conference on Islamophobia in Europe, Past and Present, organized by IRCICA and Yildiz Technical University in January 2017. We also implemented projects with international organizations in order to create and keep correct images of Islam and its civilization in the world through education. In this area, we collaborated for 6 years with the History Education Division of the Council of Europe for a project about the image of other in history teaching and interactions of cultures within and around the Mediterranean. IRCICA and Council of Europe jointly organized Symposium on Globalization and Images of the Other with the participation of schools teachers in history. Apart from this, from 2009 and 2016, IRCICA organized special sessions on countering extremism during the global forums of the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations. These forums were held in Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, Doha, Bali, and several times in Baku. People of all professions and ages participated from all continents. With these activities, we are trying to consolidate world's alertness on the issue. Education is known to be one of the main areas where tools can be developed to prevent Islamophobia. Another area where IRCICA serves with different types of activities is that of international cultural policy. In this context, we have specific projects which establish social, educational, cultural, and artistic interactions between peoples of all faiths and cultures. As always, we remain ready to collaborate and share our experiences with parties engaged in the field. I believe the Muslim world peoples and institutions will continue to join hands in solidarity to counter Islamophobia and all extremism. I believe we will also continue to take all possible steps with international organizations and their member states to give urgent priority to this question. I wish you success in your deliberations. I express my thanks and appreciation to C04-S01 Zaim University, its esteemed Rector, Professor Mehmet for the excellent cooperation. I thank Professor Sami Al-Arian, Director of Center for Islamic and Global Affairs, for his collaboration. I extend my thanks to the distinguished participants for their contributions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. May Allah bless you. Finally, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Sami Al-Arian to give briefing for the program of the conference. Dr. Sami Al-Arian is a public affairs professor and the founding director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. During his 4 decades in the US, he founded many institutions in the fields of education, research, interfaith, civil rights, Palestinian solidarity work, and political engagement. His story in the US was chronicled in the Norwegian documentary USA versus Al-Arian. In 2012, he was among 3 Muslims out of 152 people profiled in the Encyclopedia of American Dissidents, while the other 2 were Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Dr. Al-Arian has lectured and written extensively on US foreign policy, Islam and the West, the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, the Arab Spring phenomena, and civil liberties. Please welcome Dr. Arian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatimah, for your generous introduction. Once again, I want to welcome everyone to this conference. It's indeed our honor, privilege, and pleasure to have you with us in the next 3 days. And we're very pleased to host this event at this very critical time in the world, where Islamophobia has proliferated to the point where people are paying with their lives, as we've seen in Canada and New Zealand recently, as well as policies that have been adopted by many countries and many societies where they're affecting the lives of millions. So we're very pleased to have that, and I'm very grateful and thankful to Dr. Bulut and the administration of this university for making this conference possible. I'm also very grateful to our co-sponsors, IRSICA and Dr. Khalid Erid, for being there and also co-sponsoring this important event, as well as YTB, the Turks Abroad and Related Communities, who also co-sponsor this event, and very grateful in the center to have them all with us in this program. Among us are very distinguished scholars that I'm very happy to have. We have people coming from all over the world. Among the audience, we have people coming from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, South Africa, United States, United Kingdom, Austria, Canada, China, India, Gaza Strip, from across the Arab world, obviously, and many others were probably I missed. So we're very happy that this is indeed an international gathering, an international conference. Among our speakers, we have very distinguished guests, and they will be introduced in turn during their sessions. From the US, we have Dr. Ann Norton from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Hatim Bazian and Dr. Sadiq Sheikh from the University of California at Berkeley, Dr. Dalia Fahmi and Dr. Shireen Rashid from Long Island University, Dr. Deepa Kumar from Rutgers University, Dr. Tamara Son, Georgetown University, and Ahmed Badir from United Voices of America. From Canada, we have Dr. Yasmin Zain. From the UK, we have Dr. Salman Sayed from University of Leeds, Usama Al-Azami, Khadija Shayad from Edinburgh, from Cambridge actually, and Asim Qurashi, Dr. Asim Qurashi also from Cambridge. From Austria, we have Dr. Farid Hafiz. From India, we have Dr. Varsha Bashir. And from China, we have Dr. Louis Rose Loki. From Turkey, we have also distinguished professors, Dr. Salim Argun, who I will introduce in the first session, the Vice President of Diyanet and from Istanbul University, Dr. Talib Kuchukjan from Marmara University, Dr. Umar Chaha from ISO, and Dr. Nagihan Halil Ulu from Ibn Khaldun University. Among our moderators and session chairs, we also have distinguished professors, Dr. Rafza Kavakji Khan, Dr. Masud Uslu, Dr. Nuray Ujakli, Dr. Musa Tahif, Dr. Fatimah, as you have seen her here, and Linda Hayoki. All these participants and speakers and moderators, I thank you very much for your participation and thank you for being here. It was a difficult time to bring this distinguished panel, but thank God we have them all here with us. Please give them a round of applause. Actually, for some of them, I have to book them like 8 months in advance with Dr. Andrew. As I said, we're going to have 7 sessions. We want to make and 3 on each day, on Saturday and Sunday. You can see in the program, we have many topics and many presentations that we'll try to cover. We don't try to cover simply a descriptive narrative of Islamophobia. We'll try to go deep into analytical and more discussions towards the roots, the causes, and the different factors that contribute to Islamophobia around the world. And with each session, each speaker will be given about 20 minutes or so to present, and then there will be some discussion. I'm just giving you the format, and then it will be open to the audience where they present their questions, then we'll turn back to the speakers for responses. And we're hoping to have a lively discussion, and that's why we're very happy to have among us students and scholars where they can engage. And I also encourage you to engage with the speakers and with the scholars, even outside the lecture hall. Because one of the objectives here is to engage the scholars and to get deep into the discussions as we discuss Islamophobia from different aspects, including Islamophobia as service to empire, Islamophobia and Orientalism, Islamophobia and human rights, trying to rethink the clash of civilization, Islamophobia and geopolitics, and so on and so forth. There will be breaks in between the lectures. We'll try always to start on time and end on time. And also there will be lunch. Welcome to come and join in the cafeteria, which is next door to the lecture hall. The last session is a session that I would like to encourage, where we have 2 panels where the audience also, or there will be more of a conversation with the scholars towards how we can deal with Islamophobia, how we can also not only think about the problems, but we'll try also to present or to come up with solutions or at least recommendations of how people can deal with this phenomenon. So we're hoping that you'll be with us. This will be the last session. Again, I welcome you all for being with us today. Thank you for being here, and please feel free. This is a friendly environment, but also a scholarly, and we're hoping a time where you can enjoy being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. May Allah reward you for your dedication and devotion for the Ummah. With that note, thank you again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Before we disembark, we're just going to give you something to have and to remember us with. We just have, I'd like to call Dr. Mehmet bulut. Inshallah, we'll start the next session right away. If I can call to the podium Dr. Ann Norton, Dr. Salman Said, and Dr. Salim Ahmed. I would like also to welcome to this session some distinguished guests that are with us today. Particularly, I would like to welcome with us the Secretary General of the D8, who is based here in Istanbul, Dr. C04-S01. Thank you very much for being with us. This is our first session titled Systemic Roots of Islamophobia and its Future Trajectory. As you can tell from the title, we're trying to get to the essence of what Islamophobia is. Going back, I remember in the late 80s when the issues were pretty much related to the Cold War. In fact, I remember a few years earlier when the President of the United States, President Reagan, was receiving Afghani mujahideen in the White House. And they were using Islam or celebrating Islam as being one of the forces that was actually defending the world's freedom. He called them even the same as the founding fathers of the United States. Within a few years, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, somehow they became the face of the enemy of civilization. During that time, this thesis was coming to prominence, the so-called clash of civilization thesis, which was first promoted actually by Bernard Lewis. Then it was picked up by Samuel Huntington. And it became pretty much what people have been talking about now for the past quarter century. So among us we have Professor Ann Norton to talk about the clash of civilizations revisited, work in the ruins of empire. Professor Norton is the author of a very important seminal work with the title of On the Muslim Question. It reminded me of Karl Marx. I'm sure you meant it. Yes, you did. Yes, I wanted to ask you that question actually yesterday. In the 19th century, which was probably the question of the day at the time, on the Jewish questions. So it's a very important work that I recommend to everybody to read. She's also the author of many other books related to political science, such as the 95 Theses on Politics, Culture, and Method, Leo Strauss and the Politics of the American Empire, and so on and so forth. Dr. Norton was educated at the University of Chicago and is the Stacey and Henry Jackson President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was also a chairman of that department for many years. She taught at many institutions, including the University of Chicago, University of Notre Dame, Princeton, and University of Texas. She's been working on projects related to radical democracy, the problem of property, racial inequality, and the remains of empire. Our second speaker, Dr. Salman Sayyid, and he will speak to us about one of the main themes of this conference, which is basically the geopolitics of Islamophobia. Dr. Sayyid, and we are very happy to have you again this year. You were with us last year. Thank you for being with us. He's based at the University of Leeds, where he holds a chair position in social theory and decolonial thought. He's also the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy. Previously, he was professor and the inaugural director of the International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding in Australia. He's held many academic positions in London, Manchester, Adelaide, Australia, and he's also a political theorist, where his work engages with critical theory and the politics and culture of the global South. He has many books and edited books, including The Fundamental Fear, The Post-Colonial People, Thinking Through Islamophobia, and his seminal work, Recalling the Caliphate. Dr. Sayyid is the founding editor also of the interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed academic journal, Blue Orient. Thank you again for being with us. Our third speaker tonight will also address a topic that is related to Islamophobia that is affecting Muslim societies. Dr. Salim Argoon will talk to us about Islamic reform in the age of Islamophobia, asking the hard questions. Dr. Argoon He's been an assistant professor at the Faculty of Divinity at Istanbul University since 2013. He completed his bachelor in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara and his master's degree in Johannesburg, South Africa, and his PhD at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Dr. Argun is a specialist on Islamic religious endowments, the Waqf, and is published widely on the subject. He's also conducted research in the fields of Ottoman Africa and elite conflict theories. His book on elite configurations and clusters of power, Ulama Waqf and the Ottoman state, was published in 2014. He was appointed in 2017 as the Vice President of the Presidency of Religious Affairs of Diyanet in Ankara. And again, thank you very much. We missed you last year. We're very happy to have you, even though he's not feeling well. He's also coming to be with us and address us. Please give a round of applause for all three speakers to be with us today. I would like to call to the podium Dr. Anno.
I'm so much smaller than other people, sorry. I want to thank you, first of all, both the Center for Islam and Global Studies and Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University for inviting me. Those who advance the idea of a clash of civilizations envision a conflict of two cultural traditions, each ranged against the other, each monolithic, each sealed off, both armed, both imperial in their reach and influence, both wishing the other's demise. There are many errors in this imaginary. There are many empires, and they're not all European. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the British, the French, of course, but also the Mongol Empire, the Chinese, the Tamils, the Persians, the Mughals, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Incas, and the great Comanche Empire of the American Southwest. But there are also the unacknowledged empires, the empires of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and the United States, and perhaps the Empire of Capital. There are many empires, and not one is monolithic. It is in the nature of empires to be born out of and to produce conflict, and to embrace diversity, a diversity that they not only seek to alter, but they will inevitably alter them. Empires come into being and they pass away, not only through arms, technology, and wealth, religious faith, language, and cultural influence, but also by becoming other than they were. There are also things that endure beyond the death of empires, certainly language, cultural influence, and religious faith, but also certain principles of humanity and rule. I want to begin, however, with what empires ruin. What survives in the ruins of empire. What empires ruin is a relatively accessible question. First, empires displace the will of the people. An empire is never founded on the consent of the governed. People do not, with rare exceptions, join empires by choice. Certainly the conquered do not, but often the conquering soldiers and the settlers were also conscripted and taken from among the poor. So empires are at their very root joined to authoritarianism and hostile to a truly democratic sensibility. There are three forms of ruinous empire that I want to focus on. First, and perhaps most obviously, the European empires of the modern era, the French and the British notably, but also the United States in its own fashion. And related to this, they're the ideological empires of the Cold War. At their worst, these too sought an imperial dominion. At their best, they offered elements of liberation, but their best was often more dangerous than their worst. They never deferred to the will of the people, and speaking particularly of my own people, the great difficulty of the American imperial ventures has been the belief that we know what people want better than they know it themselves. And this missionary impulse has been a profoundly destructive one that is anti-democratic at its roots. These were fueled by the universalist ideologies of the Enlightenment, and they spread their conception of rationality and what was best for people with an armed hand. The same impulse animated the Soviet Union. I mean, there too, there was a universalist ideology that believed that it knew what was best for all people. And for quite similar reasons, both the former Soviet Union and the United States are vulnerable to Islamophobia. This has produced certain geopolitical phenomena, the wars in Afghanistan, persecution in Dagestan and Chechnya, American wars, undeclared and in fact largely unconstitutional, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, the licensing of continuing Israeli brutality in the American case, and support for dictatorial regimes. There's a final empire I'd like to mention, and that is the empire of capital. Capitalism is probably the only empire that one joins by choice. But is there an alternative? Perhaps it is not choice but necessity, and not consent but seduction, that leads people to value things in monetary terms and to seek profit over principles. Perhaps commodities have become what we could not want, in Gayatri Spivak's famous phrase. The empire of capital is a dangerous empire. It's dangerous in its invisibility as well as its power, in its destructive effects on the democratic. And it's dangerous, as Ibn Khaldun noted long ago, in its effects on political subjects, in its ability to weaken a political power that arises out of solidarity. These are, briefly, the empires that wreak havoc in our time. They have imposed great burdens. This is the part about what they have ruined. There is, however, one more empire I should mention, or perhaps I should call this a danger taking an imperial form, and that is Islamophobia itself. Perhaps Islamophobia is a particular threat. I think it is more likely that it is allied to a series of xenophobic phenomena, including white supremacy, continued racism against African Americans, anti-Semitism, and the fear that animates the treatment of minorities in a variety of different places. This is in many respects a virtual empire, thriving and spreading on the internet, making itself seem much larger than it is, hidden and protected until it attacks. It is responsible for great massacres like that in New Zealand, but perhaps even more devastatingly, it is responsible for the many attacks that aren't noticed. The constant fear of ordinary people going about their business, that they will face perhaps murder, perhaps assault, perhaps simply a series of losses of dignity that burden them every day. All of these empires establish dominion, create hierarchies, foster inequalities, both abroad and at home. Trying to save trees is a confusion to me. What does it mean to live within the ruins of these empires? Often it means to live within state boundaries that were created by the older European colonial powers, arbitrary maps of colonial administration and Westphalian bargaining. But perhaps there's a greater burden, and that is to live within a state system that privileges ethnicity, that encourages secession and the primacy of ethnic identity. This is something that in many respects the pan-Islamic movements of an earlier element of the decolonizing project eroded and ameliorated in certain respects. To live in the ruins of the colonial empires is also to live with continued war and violence that follows these arbitrary boundaries. But it's also to live with the intellectual systems that were often blind to contributions beyond Europe. To live with systems of property that were intimately allied, historically and structurally, with an imperial capital. The role of the companies in imperial expansion, the role of corporations from at least the 18th century to the present in securing the continued power of now defeated imperial rulers. But there was also the displacement of alternative forms of property, the commons, the waqf, and other systems of property that were founded with a greater respect for human dignity and democratic process. Living in the ruins of empire also calls forth virtues, the steadfastness of the Palestinians against the persistence of the colonial, the courage of ordinary Muslims in the face of massacres, yes, but also everyday Islamophobia. Courage, I think, is the virtue that makes democracy possible. People talk about civility and tolerance. That is not, I think, what democracy is about. Democracy is about the capacity to stand up against greater powers, whether those are the remnants of empires or colonial powers, authoritarian rule, or simply certain forms of bigotry. It is that courage upon which democratic revolutions, but also the maintenance of democracy, depend. And it is that courage that comes out of the experience of resistance to imperial power. So living in the ruins produces some of these virtues, but there is, I think, a larger question of what can be recovered from the ruins of empire. Certainly there are lost things, lost historical figures, lost celebrations, lost traditions. There are also things that might have been institutions that were displaced by colonialism that could take a different route in the present. The Ottoman Empire was certainly renowned for its capacity to adapt over time. How can it be made new in this time? It's easy to see, even from a United States that takes relatively little interest in the Ottomans, even in the United States on television, one can see the revival of an Ottoman past in public space, the Ottoman past in public cultures. But what interests me more is the philosophic contribution that can be taken from these empires. The idea of the Ummah, I think, is particularly important in relation to the democratic and recovering the democratic, but also Ijma. What can be made of this? What can people in the present do? Muslims certainly, but not only Muslims. This is a philosophy that is part of the human heritage, which all people should become conscious of, and which can be used to teach many civilizations and many people about how they govern themselves. It is perhaps through the recovery of these philosophic contributions in both the Turkish and the Islamic traditions that can be used to build out of these materials that belong to a past that is no longer with us, that can create a new empire, a consensual empire of dissent and conviction. And in order to do this, we can ask ourselves, what remains of Rome? What remains of Byzantium here? What remains here in the heart of Istanbul of these empires? It's not for me to say, it's for Turks to do. But all people can appropriate and renew not only their ancestral empires, they can renew and study the empires that they have fought, even those who have defeated them. There is a phrase among African Americans in the United States, using the master's tools. That is to say, the fact that you've been ruled by the British, as we were, or the French, or the Dutch, does not mean you should reject those teachings. It means you should make them your own. That is to say, you take what you think best, and you use those tools against the empires that once governed you, and you use them for your own independent purposes. Things that the empires rejected can be recovered, but they can be also revived, renewed, and made one's own. I think this furnishes particular tools to combat Islamophobia. It is possible, as some people have suggested recently, that Islamophobia is already on the way to defeat. That the horrors that we see, the massacres of New Zealand, in the United States, throughout the world, that these are the signs of a dying movement and not a living one. And but even if this is the case, I hope very much that it is, if this is only the desperate struggle of those who know they have already lost, there are still too many lives at stake, and it has to be countered. I think there are particular resources that are important for this. One is a notion of solidarity among Muslims, but also with allies, like I hope myself. Something that Ibn Khaldun wrote about eloquently and with great rigor. This solidarity, this asabiyya, is the beginning of power. And And you see it working. For example, in New Zealand, the indigenous people did their traditional dance, haka, for Muslims. And we also saw in the United States, Muslim, especially a group called Empower, solidarity with the indigenous in Standing Rock in opposition to the pipeline. That these acts of solidarity are profoundly important in showing to people that they have common aims, and that those they might have distrusted are their allies and can be their friends. In other words, we have to learn to love difference. This has always been my favorite contribution from Islamic philosophy, and particularly from the philosopher Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi has a passage in which he takes Plato, and he takes Plato when Plato is making fun of democracy and dismissing it as something that young boys and women like. And he rewrites it so that it becomes instead a praise of the democratic, of the way in which democratic cities open up and contain difference, that they produce new forms of learning, new children, as he says, of all races and colors. That richness, that capacity to contain more, is something that Al-Farabi recognized when Plato could not see. And that is, I think, one of the things that can give strength to democratic movements, to movements of the consent of the people throughout the world. But it's also a heritage which is in many ways peculiar to this place and to the Ottoman inheritance. There is a long history here of living with difference, and of living well with difference, of accommodating different forms of life and different ethnicities, of developing institutions that protect minorities, of seizing new alphabets, new ideas, new philosophies, and making theirs one's own. And for this reason, I think that this place between Europe and Asia, with this history in the ruins of these empires, is perhaps the best site to combat Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, our next speaker is Professor Sami. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you very much for the organizers, for the university, and for CIGA for inviting me and holding the second conference on Islamophobia. I'm going to try and talk about two main things, really, but it might turn out to be three things. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get this sense I write something in the evening, and I think it's really fantastic. And then I wake up the next morning, and I think, who wrote this rubbish? Unfortunately, it turns out to be me. And the reason I'm mentioning this story is I'm hoping that some of you share this, is that I feel this way about the title of this talk in many ways. The title started off with, it looked like a good idea. I'll talk about the geopolitics of Islamophobia. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that my title is actually an oxymoron. That geopolitics and Islamophobia don't really go together in the way that one can think. So I have two options. I could admit to my mistake and sit down quietly, or I could do what good academics try and do, and tell you that it's part of an elaborate scheme and try and connect them together, and voila, at the end of it, you will see how these two things work together. I'll try the second part. Okay? All right, so let's see if this works. This could be a very short talk. Okay, so talking about geopolitics is very, very easy and also very hard. It's very easy because it's something that everybody does. Soon as they see some kind of conflict in the world, you will have people talking about how someone is going to move this and there, or they're going to move their tanks there, or they're going to do this and that. And in the end, the metaphors for geopolitics often are like board games. It's like a game of Risk or a game of chess. And in fact, the game of chess is often used by geopoliticians, like Kissinger and Brzezinski, as a way of talking about geopolitics. But the thing about geopolitics, in this sense, I would argue, it's not really a board game. And I'll try and show this to you. Because in a board game, two things are constant. One, the surface of a board game is fixed. In chess, there's 64 squares with alternating between dark and light, and there are 16 pieces. And that's it. All you have to do is maneuver around there. Similarly, in a Risk, you've got the map of the world divided into different continents, and you move your pieces around, and at some time, after you play this for a couple of hours, you're bored and you kick the board over, but anyway, off it goes. But the idea is this, that somehow you are working with constants and continuities. Now, this is not that dissimilar to the initial idea of what geopolitics is. So take, for example, this map, which is based on one of the earlier writers and considered founders of geopolitics, Mackinder, who wrote a famous essay in 1904 called The Geographical Pivot of History. And the argument in this essay is something like that the history of the world can be told through the way in which geography determines historical flows. So, for example, basically the argument is that you have what he calls the pivot area, which is largely landlocked, and it's basically flat, which is basically the center of the world. Anyone who controls the pivot area is able to exercise control over the rest of the planet, and basically you have then around it various concentric rings. Now the reason why this is important is because this sort of conversation, this kind of talk, has been the subject of much geopolitical reflections and thinking. So often it becomes that American policy since 1945 has been based on the idea of trying to contain the pivot area or the heartland, or it's got different names at some point, by building rings around it to prevent the areas of Europe, those that face the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean, as a way of being able to control history. That's basically. So if you want to know what history is, you basically look at the map of the world, you see the spatial arrangement, and history basically occurs in the interaction between those two things. Okay? Now, the problem with all of this is that there is no room for anything except geography. If you look at, for example, Mackinder's own essay, he spends most of the time, he gives a kind of historical survey, talking about the different kind of political entities that occupied the pivot area over time. Yeah? If you take more closely look at the time, you will notice that, for example, whether this is, and Kissinger says, it doesn't matter that it's no longer the Soviet Union which occupies the pivot area, now we have the Russian Federation, but the logic of history is still the same. So there's no difference between the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, the Russian Empire is the same. And if there was a Chinese-Japanese takeover of the pivot area, it would still be the same. So in the end, all history is completely determined by these geographical constants. Yeah? Okay. So that's my first part of the geopolitics. Now the reason why this becomes a problem is because there are two of these things there. One of them is actually a recorder, so I've been pressing that for 5 minutes, not working on it. And I'm wondering why it's not working. Okay. So the idea that here is this, that interactions between politics and space are based around these kind of continuities, around sort of what Brodel calls longue durée, and they kind of determine what kind of politics are possible around this arrangement in a way. Now, if you believe, as I do, that basically what we are talking about when we discuss politics is a kind of retrospective reconstruction of rationality, rather than something that was already planned out, then this idea of these continuities becomes contested and challenging. What may look continuous to us now and seems like an elaborate plan rather the way that I'm talking about this talk has been carefully thought out, but it may have arisen from something very contingent. And what we are often seeing is the attempt to disguise contingency through these retrospective reconstructions of rationality. Yeah? Okay. Think about this for a bit. Now, when we come to Islamophobia, where does Islamophobia sit? Now, Anne actually mentioned quite interestingly about the virtualness of Islamophobia, and I think it's quite helpful. If you think about it, Islamophobia is not considered to be something which is hardwired into geography as such. It sits on top. It's an epiphenomenon. As it's epiphenomenal, it shouldn't really have a geopolitics in that way. Yeah? Now, when we're accounting for Islamophobia, you could say we are confronted by what it actually means to be something which is superficial or epiphenomenal. I would say to you there are mainly three main narratives which explain or try to explain the causes of Islamophobia. The first one I will call is economistic, in which Islamophobia is really a cover for the working out of capital or the working out of some other kind of economic processes. So in a way, Islamophobia either is the excuse for the military-industrial complex, or excuse for security industrial complex, or excuse for oil, wars of oil acquisition, etc., etc. What is just driving it is really economic logic, and Islamophobia is simply the veneer which enables and justifies that. Yeah? The second one, which is what I call the apologistic account of Islamophobia. And that is that what the real cause of Islamophobia is Muslims. And it has two kinds of variations on that. One is that the real cause of Islamophobia is the one that Muslims often use. If Muslims would only learn to behave themselves and behave like good Muslims, people would not dislike them. They would not hate them. The problem with that is when you look at what's happened, for example, with the Rohingya, what exactly did the Rohingya do that deserves their elimination, that deserves the fact that they were deprived of citizenship, they were deprived of ability to have children, they're deprived of many, many restrictions which are put onto them simply by the fact that they are Rohingya. Yeah? Similarly, you could say with the Uyghur in China, where you have an almost Orwellian state being put, where short of actually putting chips into people's skins, you basically got a whole kind of technology being used to surveillance and produce a system, a gulag, a virtual digital gulag with all the intended violences of that. But the apologistic account starts by simply saying that the real issue is for Muslims to blame themselves in somehow, that they need to explain, they need to account for their behavior, and if their behavior was modified, if they were not prone to extremism, violence, etc., we wouldn't have these problems. Again, with the apologistic account, is that it is still on the surface here. Islamophobia now has been relocated to the interior of the people, or interior of individuals, but it's still a problem in a way. And I guess the third account I would say is a reactive one, in which Islamophobia is seen as being justified by others for the kind of violence and terror of Muslims, etc. So in a way that both the apologistic account, which is an internal one, and the reactive one dovetail together. But all three of these accounts see Islamophobia simply as a symptom. It's not the problem itself. It's simply a symptom of something else. It is on the surface of something. Okay. Where is Islamophobia? Here is a group of countries that you could argue, and we could all debate whether they are Islamophobic or not. Some of them. We could debate whether some countries, you have governments which are following Islamophobic policies. In others, you have societies and governments together. And occasionally you just have societies which are being Islamophobic and the governments aren't. It's rare, but it's possible. Yes? Now, in this range of countries, you would say, well, wait a minute, you've just thrown a random group of countries together, and there is no kind of logic to them. You included countries from different continents, you've included countries from different kind of economic development levels, you've included countries, most controversially, which are Muslim or have Muslim populations, as well as countries which have no Muslim populations, or countries where they have substantial Muslim minority populations. How could they all be Islamophobic? Well, in every single case of the slide before, I would say to you, there is a figure of the Muslim. It's not about the empirical Muslim. It's not about a real Muslim. It's about what the Muslim represents. And here are some of the common themes that Muslims represent. Muslims as terrorists, extremists, invaders, immigrants, separatists, treacherous, violent, misogynist, supremacists, racist, lecherous, Islamofascists. And if I knew how to rap, that could be a really great line there. Now, none of these are exclusive, and you can say that they play out in different ways. But there is a family resemblance to them. That is how one of the ways that Islamophobia is manifested. Now, these are not just labels. They contain with them practices. So take the most easiest one to demonstrate. Terrorist. If you think Muslims are terrorists, it's not just going around a schoolyard calling a Muslim child a terrorist or Osama bin Laden or whatever. It's actually the whole panoply of state practices that ensue from that. How you are regulated, how you are observed, how you are screened or not screened because of that. There's a whole machinery which is invented. How people's dreams become sources of their markers of their radicalization or terrorism, etc. Even your dreams are not possible to be free, right? Similarly, if you think about the invader, the idea of the Muslim invader. Now, the most recent alarming element of that was when 50 Muslims were killed in Christchurch. 200,000 Muslims have been displaced and hundreds of thousands have been killed in Burma because they are considered to be invaders. In India, Muslims who've been there for 800 years or longer are considered to be invaders. So what constitutes an invader is very, very problematic. The notion of the immigrant, again, it is all about being outside society. Okay, so we have the figure of the Muslim, which I would argue is what unifies all of these components. All of the different places where Islamophobia appears is because they trade upon a discourse in which the figure of the Muslim is central. What the figure of the Muslim means is what is key here. And what I would like to suggest to you, that the figure of the Muslim is a reminder of the contingency of this world. Now, if you want to take this in a Quranic sense, you can, but or you can take it in a more secularist sense or a more banal sense. But Muslims remind us that this world is contingent. This world is not forever. This world has a history. And there is a next world. Again, you don't have to be theological about the next world, but the idea of the world is simply another kind of organization. In every single case that I've mentioned to you, the Muslim is seen to be the grit, the thing that makes the country impossible to be itself. What China, Burma, Bangladesh, all the other countries that I've mentioned in that list, and many more, have in common is the idea that the Muslim presence is by itself unsettling. It is unsettling of the world as it is today. Okay, now that we've come to talk about worlds, I will do this neat trick, and I hope you don't notice it's a trick. But if you do, you can ask me questions about it. If geopolitics is about geography, what could be more geographical than the world? And in the sense what I'm talking about here is this, that perhaps what we need to think about is the idea of the world as being made. And in that sense, what Islamophobia appears in this conjuncture is a way of holding on to a world that is now no longer possible to project into the future. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that Islamophobia is a response to the vulnerability of a world that can be changed. And that has many, many different tokens. The one token which is perhaps the most explicit is what unifies nearly all neoconservative and all white, what I call white revanchism, is the idea of the Muslim, the Islamicization. What is seen as a loss for others of what is seen as a loss of white privilege, for example, is seen as not justice, but actually a destruction of a way of life. This is why nearly all the discourse around white revanchism is about the restating of whiteness, restating the white nation, restating the order. And I'm not even talking about the dark net and etc. who want to restore slavery, etc. I'm just talking about even at the mainstream level. There's an idea of the restoration. And then you say, okay, so white supremacy, but hey, what about Burma? What about India? What about China? What do they have to do with white supremacy? Well, here's the thing now. Whiteness does not connote phenotype. It never has. It also becomes a way of life. If you look at the discourse in China, Burma, etc., what is being told is that the Muslims are preventing the modernization of these countries, or they are a stop to modernity there. They are halting the progress of these nations. So, I'll finish now. If you want to talk about geopolitics as a game, don't. But if you must, then remember this is a game that moves as you play. In which case, it means that both the pieces and the board can change and will change through the interactions that occur in that game. In which case, I would say to you, what we have in the geopolitics of Islamophobia is really the constitution of a grammar world order, of how the world sits together. And what we have then is not so much just geography, but something before geography, which is the ability to read maps itself. And there's a cartography here. And before that cartography is a sense of grammar. So in a sense, what Islamophobia, the geopolitics of Islamophobia, is really about how the world is being configured and being produced in a world in which the Muslim presence is hostile to its perpetuation. And that is the real challenge. And now I will sit down. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our last and final speaker is Dr. Sami, and he will talk to us, as I said earlier, about Islamic reform in the age of Islamophobia, asking the hard questions.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Very respected Professor Bulut and Professor Al-Arian, distinguished scholars, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation to this important conference. And I would like to specifically thank Professor Al-Arian for organizing this symposium and for the invitation. And I find this event timely and significant. Timely because after the March 15 Christchurch brutal attack, the concept of Islamophobia has took another turn. And there is a dire need for its reconceptualization. And also, I believe this organization, this conference is timely because I'm representing an organization which is the Presidency of Religious Affairs of Turkey. We run about 2,000 mosques in 160 non-Muslim countries. So on a daily basis, we receive reports of Islamophobic attacks on our mosques, affiliated NGOs, and even our congregations and members. Therefore, it's timely, and as we speak now, actually, President of Diyanet is on an airplane heading to New Zealand to meet with the victims of the family of that brutal attack. And as a person who is in charge of international relations at Diyanet, I am supposed to be in that airplane. But now, since I broke my promise in the first international conference to Dr. Al-Arian, I couldn't break my promise twice, and therefore I'm here and thanking him for organizing the conference. I find the second international conference on Islamophobia significant because last week hundreds of thousands of far-right white nationalist groups gathered in Finland to attend another second annual conference under the banner of Awakening Conference, which took place in the coastal city of Turku in Finland. Most of these extremist groups have their political bureaus, media outlets, but they do also have their paramilitary wings. No need to say that the manifesto of the New Zealand shooter has intimate familiarity with the ideas and the symbols of these extremist groups. What we see today is there is a growing internationalization tendency of the modern far-right movement around different corners of the globe. This identitarian movement now, I believe, constitutes a growing global terror threat. Therefore, in the wake of these two alarming developments, I find the CIGA conference timely and significant, and once again, thank you for organizing the event. Having said that, however, and while we combating Islamophobic attacks, biased media coverages, racial profilings, xenophobic discriminations, there is also reform calls being made in some European nation states under the banner of European Islam, French Islam, German Islam, Austrian Islam, and political authorities in those countries try to promote a version of Islam which they think is more compatible with the values and laws of their countries. In French President Macron's terms, a version of religion practiced in peace by believers who will not have the need to loudly proclaim their faith. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, a clear distinction between Islam and the West is no longer possible. The boundaries are blurring. Millions of Muslim men and women live in the West, and many are citizens of Western nations, and they are therefore now inextricably part of the West. However, intolerance towards Muslims and Islam has been gradually increasing in recent decades, alongside Islamophobia, and particularly the programmatic efforts to reshape and transform Islam from within. The concept of Islamic reform became a milestone of Western Islamophobic discourse. The billion-dollar Islamophobic industry in the United States and Europe is indifferent to meaningful dialogue or the genuine exchange of ideas. They are unapologetically uninterested in seriously engaging in a sophisticated, nuanced discussion about Islam and Muslims in the West. In the age of the rising Islamophobic trends, the discourse of reform in Islam is not only shaped by its context, but also by different political and social agendas. For European politicians, for example, the Islamic reform means, in many ways, the disconnection of European Muslims from religious streams and doctrines that are considered radical and foreign. Does Islam really need a reform? Is it reform or revival? What could be the essential elements of Muslim, if I might use the term, reformation? Considering Islam from a Western position of presuming Western epistemology as an only universal fact, various Western intellectuals have argued over the past decades that Muslims need their own Martin Luther to save themselves from intolerance and dogmatism. However, this popular belief that Islam condemns freedom and political, social, and economic progress is a myth, as indicated by previous scholars. Some early Protestants, desperately seeking religious freedom for themselves, found inspiration, as Professor Norton indicated, that in the Ottoman Empire, which was then more tolerant to religious plurality than most Catholic kingdoms. Jean Bollin, himself a Catholic but a critical one, openly admired this fact. The great emperor of the Turks, the political philosopher, wrote in 1580s, detested not the strange religion of others, but to the contrary, permitted every man to live according to his or her conscience. That's why Luther himself had written about Protestants who want the Church to come and rule because they think our German people are wild and uncivilized. However, I have to state that colonization, which has cut Muslims from their roots, traditions, and history, has also led Muslim societies to lose their own narrative. Who they are, who they should be, what is right and what is wrong is now defined by others and not Muslims. Although Islam preaches the importance of progress, education, science and technology, effective economic management, governance and economic prosperity, to all shortcomings and challenges in the Islamic world have been experienced post-colonially are attributed to religion. Here I would like to make two important points. Once, Frantz Fanon said, the feeling of inferiority of the colonized is the correlative to the Europeans' feeling of superiority. Let us have the courage to say that it is the racist who creates his inferior. I repeat, it is the racist who creates his inferior. The common sense of inferiority and the loss of self-confidence that are originated from the hazards left by the colonization of Muslim world and the Muslim mind are determinant. Since the lack of esteem and the complex of inferiority had not yet plagued the Muslim society back then, throughout the golden age of Islam and the period of crusades, the Islamic civilization were capable to recover and after the challenges that intended to annihilate Islam's very existence. The second point is, along with its worldwide distribution, its continuing vitality and universalist aspirations, Islamic civilization has achieved to survive the greatest challenges throughout the history by building new madrasas, namely by seeking the solution in Islamic knowledge. It has been this way during the Crusades and likewise after the Mongol invasion. However, to respond to the Western imperial challenge of 19th century, Muslim scholars were delayed to recalling the Islamic knowledge. It is still what is needed to be done to struggle the challenges of today's world. The reform in Islam, in the sense of change in the main principles and fundamentals of Islam, is not applicable, since Islam is eternal and universal. So there is no need or there is no room to reform it. By its sense, Islam can be implemented in all times and places without any reform. However, it does not mean Islam disallows a change in the way the religion is understood, implemented, and lived in different times or places. Scriptural sources, the Quran and Sunnah, remain the primary reference and fundamental of faith and practice are left as they are, but our reading and our understanding of the texts, the hermeneutics, will be renewed by the contributions of those scholars and thinkers who will point to new perspectives by reviving timeless faith in our hearts, while stimulating our minds so as to enable us to face the challenges of our respective times. Since the religion of Islam, as contained in the Quran and Hadith, has already been revealed and will remain intact, needing neither addition nor subtraction, but only interpretation and application. Definitely it is the application which tends to wane with time. That means revivals. The word tajdeed, therefore, means the renewal of the application of Islam in society, revitalizing the Muslim community, and returning it to the path of Islam afresh. In this part, I would like to give a bird's eye view of the revivalist scholars, some revivalist scholars in the late 18th and early 19th century. The 18th and 19th centuries were the period of great intellectual activity that witnessed systematic attempts to radically restructure traditional Islamic thought. These attempts were diverse and extremely successful, both in terms of intellectual reception and political and social impact. The first example is from India, Sheikh Waliullah al-Dehlawi, who is recognized as one of the most distinguished Muslim scholars that India ever produced. And mutually opposed schools claim to derive from the best represent his true thought. The second is Sheikh Uthman bin Fudi in Western Africa, who is also considered the most central figure in the legacy of Islamic Nigeria and Islamist discourse of West Africa. Partly as a result of his political success in establishing the Sokoto Caliphate. And lastly, in North Africa, Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Sanusi and his emphasis on the individual choice and responsibility. In addition to his tolerance, amount to program for establishment of a democratic utopia. Generally speaking, these and other thinkers were intellectually assertive even when they were not in the positions of power. What is striking is, even though these Muslim scholars and their people were under the attack of colonizing powers, facing great challenges and hardships, there is no mentioning of reformation or westernization in their thoughts, but rather they were examples of the revivalist movements which aimed to reform, if I may use the term, from within. Reform of the applications and variables, not the essentials and core principles of the religion. While Waliullah al-Dahlawi undertook to revive the intellectual legacy of Islam through mediation and synthesis, Ibn Fudi deployed the weapon of Islamic literacy in his battle for social and political reform. And Sanusi's emphasis on individual choice and responsibility, in addition to his tolerance, amount to a program for the establishment of a new school of thought. There is, of course, how Islamic reform is understood from the Western point of view. A big question. How Islamic reform in Islamophobic discourse is implemented by the governments. For instance, Samuel Huntington says Islam's borders are bloody and so are its innards. To defeat the extremists for good, Muslims must reject those aspects of their tradition that prompt some believers to resort to oppression and holy war. Gudrun Kremer says Muslim reformers cannot affect a reformation in the spirit of Martin Luther because Islam lacks a clerical hierarchy invested with the authority to offer indulgence for sins. The very thing that outraged the German. In Islam there are no sacraments and no ordained clerics. Lay persons are not excluded from reciting sacred texts. And I also gave the example of the French President Macron's outrageous statements on how Islamic reform is viewed in their perception. There are many trajectories when it comes to the reform or reformation or revivalism, but which trajectory of reform, or rather preferably revival path that Muslims will follow? Which trajectory that Muslim minorities will follow? And which trajectory of Muslim majority countries will follow? In conclusion, the 19th century was an age of colonialism. The Muslim world has been exploited and invaded by great powers, both physically and intellectually. The continental Europe, that covers only 15% of the total global land area, has mandated the remaining 85% of the global mainland. In the sphere of this political context of the 19th century colonialism, advocating revivalism and reformation of Islam, three major thinkers and actors from various regions of the Muslim world announced that reformation of Muslim society should be implemented with internal dynamics by reviving the essence of Islam. I personally suppose, while reviving the essence and the principal values of Islam on the one hand, we should introduce the world to our Muslim youth, raise and educate them as global citizens on another, and equip with them with the universal religious language to address the contemporary challenges of the postmodern world. Since, as pointed out by Sheikh Waliullah al-Dahlawi, the prophetic language presents a way comprehensible to the common man with its clarity, simplicity, and lies within the compass of our ordinary reason. That's what we need. We have to develop that understanding and that language in combating the Islamophobia. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for our distinguished panelists for their presentations. Thought-provoking and excellent presentations addressing the topics that they were assigned. As I said earlier, about 25, 26 years ago, there was the article about the clash civilization followed by the book. And there were certain assertions, and since then we've seen 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Zionist onslaught in Palestine. We've seen the breakup of many countries and societies. We've seen the setbacks of the Arab Spring, and this yearning towards democracy has been crushed. And we've seen the rise of Islamophobia for sure. So my question, obviously, to Anne, is the prediction, has it borne out? Is there something that we can see from this trajectory, that we can understand, looking back 26 years? Is Islamophobia inherent in this struggle, or is it just a tool, useful tool? And how do we understand, if we want to interpret history based on this, and the role of Islamophobia that has proliferated? And it's been obviously, someone mentioned, one of our speakers, hundreds of millions, if not billions, have been spent since in trying to create at least this division between the Muslim world and others. It's the Muslim world being the game that Professor Said was talking about, where the different powers are trying to maneuver around for their power and control and hegemony. And the same question, obviously, would also be asked to Dr. Sayed. Are we talking about, because obviously in his list of countries, you can see Muslim majority, or minorities, or even no Muslims at all. So this is not about being a Muslim to be Islamophobic or non-Muslim. This is about something much more. He defined in terms of modernization, I believe, and I want him to elaborate a bit. So here you can find the possibility of having alliances, different alliances taking shape. And we need to define those forces, for the lack of a better word, who uses Islamophobia in order to advance their interests. And this obviously has, some of it is economic, but also mostly political and geopolitical. How do we fight this? How can we ally, how the forces that align themselves on one hand, how the other forces can ally themselves on the other hand? How do we fight this? And on the issue of Islamic reform, I'd like you to address, if possible, Dr. Argun, when we talk about Islamic reform, in that question by itself, that means you have to be critical in certain aspects in order to reform. That means there's something that you're trying to deal with. And when you pose these questions, they are immediately jumped on by the Islamophobic forces. So they're afraid even to pose the questions because they could be used and utilized in advancing the Islamophobic discourse. And therefore, that by itself makes you hesitant to actually ask the questions and deal with them in a courageous way. So how do we deal with this in the age of Islamophobia? How do we deal with these hard questions without falling into the trap with these people? The questions of women, the questions of minorities, the questions of ethnicity, the questions of citizenship, and so on. So all these questions, when you try to advance them because you are trying to reform or looking forward, these people will immediately jump on it. And obviously the conservative parts who don't want any reform, they also take advantage because now you're siding with the Islamophobes. Now you're siding with the anti-Muslims. So that's very very difficult to deal with. So if you can, just for a minute or two or more, if you like, just address these questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. Dr. Mehmet.
Yes, and I've lost my pen, so I hope I can back this in my mind. I'm sorry. I think that question, if I can rephrase it slightly, the question that you directed to me, although I think it also belongs to you, is Islamophobia epiphenomenal or is it constitutive? And I think that the answer is oddly both. That is to say, I think that it is epiphenomenal in the sense that something else might serve, and in fact, other things have served and are serving as enemies against which one orders one's own conduct, as enemies who structure your vision of the world, as an alternative to your form of life. There's so many, a number of things that can and have filled that in a given country. It's also epiphenomenal, I think, in the sense that the image of the shifting field and the shifting players, it captures this quite exactly. I mean, is the problem with Islam an ethnicity? Is it an identity? Is it a religion? Is this a conflict in which Christianity should rally against the Muslim? Is it something that people bring from other countries? What is it? And it can shift. And that shifting is always strategic, always conditioned by the politics and history of that given moment in that place. So in those senses, it is something that floats above and is constantly shifting. But there is a sense, I think, in which it is a core and continuing phenomenon. And I would say that sense is twofold. One is simply the fact, I would say, that people constitute themselves in opposition. And so that practice of finding an other against which you define yourself is the continuing practice. And so we have to learn ways of understanding a relation of otherness as something other than enmity. And there are certainly models for that. The other sense, I think, in which it might be a core is a much more troubling one. And I think it has both fear and promise in it. And that is that Islam is a universal religion. It claims to be truth for all human beings. Christianity is also a universalist religion. And in its own way, science and economics make the same claim. It's about value, or it's about something that we can demonstrate through reason. And I think the conflict of these universal understandings of the world is a fundamental one. I also believe, perhaps because of my teacher, Father Rahman, perhaps because I'm a more hopeful human being, that these are, at their best, conflicts which can be reconciled. And so, although I think that is a fundamental set of conflicts, but it is a set of conflicts which we have to take seriously. It's not about, it shouldn't be about my accommodations or trying to become something, giving up one's principles or one's faith. It should be presenting those loudly and openly. And yes, a coexistence which is honest and frank and unconcealed. One doesn't have to say, your faith is as good as mine, if one doesn't believe it. One simply has to lay out the principles in an honest way and listen to the other. So, but that is not an easy business. And you have to deal with it every day.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. I don't think it can be epiphenomenal and constitutive in the sense that we may mean different things. So it can be if you say what you say, and it can't be if I say what I say, if that makes any sense. But let me start somewhere else on this. Nobody in this room would want to live in a world without conflict, except under one condition, in which everyone in this room agreed with them. So think about the logic of that. The absence of conflict would also mean the absence of transformation. It would mean the absence of disagreement. It would mean the absence of actually changing things. And we're quite used to the idea of people wanting an end to conflict or wanting peace when they have all the pieces they want. So the idea, it seems to me, is that the contingency of the conflict, in a way, there is two different aspects to here, is how we manage how do we manage conflict without erasing conflict? And that, I think, is a challenge for all of us, in a way. That, for example, it's possible that we on the panel may disagree. there is a conflict. But I hope it will not reach a certain threshold of violence or abuse or something like that. So we managed through that. But if there was no conflict of our views, you would be very bored. And we would be very bored. And we would not have anything to say to each other anyway. But even that's not good enough, because there must be a time when you think actually the conflict is worth getting violent about as well. That is also a condition there. So the only thing I would want to say with this is that the notion of conflict and resolving conflict is more difficult than simply wishing for the resolution of conflict. Everyone in this room is very keen to resolve the conflict as long as it's resolved on the conditions that everyone agrees with them. So if you want no conflict in this room, agree with me, and I will not have conflict with anyone. And that, it seems to me, is actually quite a fundamental problem here. But the question, I think, I want to link this up with the notion of the epiphenomenal. In one way, I guess we're all, it depends, in one way we're all dead. In the long run, we're all going to be dead. Does that mean that every death and the way we die is no differences in the way there? And I think one of the issues here is this, that true, you could read the history of humanity as history of different kinds of conflicts. And you could say, actually, in the end, it doesn't matter what the conflict is. But I would say to you, it's like saying that if you read one book, why read another? Because in the end, all books are the same. They have words on paper, or nowadays on electronic form, but they have words on something else. Why bother reading? Because at some level of abstraction, everything becomes the same. But the whole point is this, that we would say that every time you read, even if you read genre fiction, if you read a detective story after another detective story after another detective story, at a certain point all of them are the same. But it is those little differences that actually make them meaningful for you. So it seems to me that one of the issues must be that if we are saying that it's true, that to have conflict, you need to have a distinction between friends and enemies. You can't have a conflict without friends and enemies. But how and why, how the enemy and the friend is actually constituted is actually very, very significant. And it seems to me it comes with its own trace, it comes with its own history. So in a sense, specifically of Islamophobia, and why I think it is constitutive of where we are, is precisely because that list of countries that I put together, and it's not an exhaustive list, and many of us can disagree with who's in there, who's out of it as well, is that all of them, that is the only thing that is connecting them, I would argue, is how they represent the Muslim, the figure of the Muslim in their own societies. So take something like Angola, which I think, or Czech Republic. Out of a population of 10 million, there are about 3,000 Muslims. 3,000. But the foreign minister of the Czech Republic has talked about a super Holocaust caused by the Islamization of Czechoslovakia. How will 3,000 Muslims turn a country of 10 million into fully Islamicized? That is not an uncommon phenomenon, right? So it seems to me what we're talking about is why is it that the figure of the Muslim has that particular currency right now? And I think a number of things trace into that, the question of terror, etc., I talked about them. So it seems to me that there is a sense in which the Muslim is the one that is left out of the process of this kind of, whatever you want to call it, whether it's a neoliberal consumption of the world, whether it's a westernization of the world, whether it's a modernization of the world. But really it is about how the world, the future is already, what prevents the future is the stubbornness of the Muslim. And whatever that future may be. And in that sense, this is ironic, because then I think the question of reform and all of these turn into it. Because in a way, what stops the advance of history is the figure of the Muslim, because the Muslim is considered to be ahistorical. And everything that the Muslim, and everything that talk about the reform, talk about the medievalism of Islam and Muslims, all of that refers to the idea that somehow Muslims are static beings, a being without time. That is why. So you can only talk about reform because you imagine a community that hasn't been constantly changing, and there haven't been constant debates around that. So for that reason, I would say the question of modernization, and what I was talking about modernity, perhaps a better word, is really the Muslim is what stops history. That is what the figure of the Muslim, I would say, represents. And I think that's constitutive of this conjuncture, but it may not be constitutive of other conjunctures.
Thank you. Dr.
Well, thank you very much, Al-Arian, for this question. I think when it comes to asking the hard questions in Muslim communities, you are between a rock and hard place, as they say in America. How do we deal with these questions, especially from the youth perspective? Yes, there is a possibility of hijacking these questions by some far-right extremist groups and using them to promote their own agendas on the one hand, but there is, in some parts of the Muslim world, there is a resistance to deal with these questions. But I think we should, as Muslim community, when I say we have to face these questions, and we have to ask these hard questions and try to answer these questions, benefiting from the scriptural sources and our great tradition. When we look at the tradition, our great scholars and ulama did ask these questions when they had to face the Greek philosophy or Indian mysticism. They faced and they challenged them. And this did not constitute a problem for them. Today we have to do the same thing, I believe. We have to ask these questions and try to find reasonable and plausible reasons, especially in order to present to our youth. If we do not ask these questions, then the gap between the older generations and the younger generations will be growing. I think these are important issues that we have to deal. And pointing out to Professor Said's final remarks, and I totally agree with him, we have to be the part of our time as Muslims. We have to, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have to engage our people to the current conditions and the challenges of the world. So we have to be dynamic and receptive to different cultures and raise world citizens, a new generation of Muslim world citizens.
Thank you very much. Now about 20 minutes for questions from our audience. Please raise your hand, the microphone will come to you. Identify yourself and try to be brief within 90 seconds.
Can I raise my hand first?
Yes,
Ask permission.
Yes.
Because I have a flight to catch.
Rector Al-Arian has a flight to catch. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
There is an plaque that I need to give you. Thank you again, Dr. Salim. Please raise your hand so I can see you high, if possible. In the back there. I'll come to you, inshallah. Can you just hand us the microphone? Who has the microphone? All right, so we'll start here and then we'll go there. Always identify yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the panelists, for your wonderful insights, and welcome to CIGA. My name is Awais Khan. I'm a researcher here at CIGA. I think I saw two different ideas of Islamophobia emerge over the course of this talks, and maybe you could clarify this. One in which Islamophobia is trying to be a panacea for all conflict, where phobia is something that can be treated, and then we could have a world where there's no phobia. And then another one that is more realistic. So Islamophobia isn't about getting rid of conflict, but actually making conflict more acute, meaning we identify where the conflict is and we try to analyze critically why there is conflict and how to deal with it, which isn't trying to get rid of conflict. Now, in that mode of trying to figure out who the enemy is, well, if you're not trying to get rid of conflict, you're trying to analyze who the enemy is, then that also raises the question of who the friend is. So in the word Islamophobia, what do we mean by Islam here? What do we mean by Islam? What kinds of Muslims are being targeted? Because everybody isn't just a victim of Islamophobia. It's a certain kind of Muslim that's being a victim of Islamophobia. So how can we identify what is the Islam in Islamophobia?
Good question. We're going to take all the questions at once, and then if you have a particular person that you would like him to answer the question, please let us know. Whether it's Professor Said, Professor Modi. We're going to take about 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll give him the opportunity to answer. In the back there, go ahead, identify yourself, ask your question.
First of all, thank you so much for such an incredible panel. My name is Ratu. I'm a first-year undergraduate student in Istanbul University. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Anna Norton. Such an incredible presentation. I get a point from your presentation is that the solidarity is such a plays a main role in combating Islamophobia. However, ironically, right now, especially in the mainstream media, Muslims are being misrepresented and also misportrayed. As a result, it increased the number of bigotry and also intolerance, the act of bigotry and intolerance. So how do we exactly accomplish the society that is like a compassion and solidarity towards each other, and at the end we can combat the Islamophobia itself? Thank you.
Okay. All right. This side, Junaid, do we have a microphone on this side? I'm going to try to go 3 questions each section, 1 question. Okay, we'll prepare for this section. All right, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Identify yourself.
Sorry?
Identify yourself.
I'm Junaid Ahmed. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds in sociology. And my question is to a brilliant scholar whose work I admire very much, and it's not Professor Salman Said, who's my supervisor, whose work I also admire, but it's Professor Norton. The presentation was excellent, and I learned a lot. And I've read your work, and it's been absolutely brilliant. Just a couple of questions that came up. At the beginning, you had started by mentioning a number of different empires, and in that you lumped together modern colonial European empires, as well as Aztec, Mayan, all of these things. And I was wondering how useful is it to deploy the term empire for all of these communities, civilizations that had existed. And I think later on you yourself referred to this empire of capital. Now, you'll be familiar with Ellen Nexon-Wood's book on the title, in which she makes a good case in trying to distinguish. One of the books that makes the distinction between the different types of empires. But the larger question is how useful are these terms? Why can't we, as Professor Said has suggested at times, why don't we say the European sultanates or something? Why do we have to use the language of Eurocentrism to define all of these other places? The other thing I just wanted to ask, as a second thing, was when you were speaking of, and of course this is a desire and a hope of all of us, that Islamophobia somehow reduces and declines. However, I think this takes us back to the discussion that you were having earlier, the epiphenomenal versus constitutive. I think once Professor Say that joked, or meant it seriously, that in fact, Islam in some ways constitutes Europe. Islam has constituted Europe. In some ways, it made me think of Islamophobia constituting Europe today, in that sense, that the crisis of whiteness, the crisis of Eurocentrism, of 500 plus years of European hegemony, right now seems utterly dependent upon the Islamophobia and whipping that up as constitutive of it to restore something at play. So I was wondering on that. And the last thing is when you said that it seems like it's dying and going away. We also see the obituaries of political Islam being said in the same way. Well, this attack, 9/11, etc., it shows a sign of their weakness of political Islam, that they're undertaking these attacks and what's happened. So we have to be careful in reading and misreading these events, I think, in these situations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, in the back.
First of all, thanks so much. My name is Mustafa Wazbeka, and I graduated from anthropology. My first two questions are for Professor Anna. You have mentioned four empires. So, first one is European, empire, Russian empire, and then, capitalism and Islamophobia. Don't you think that what we have today in this variety of the upbringing of identities, the upbringing of multiculturalism, the upbringing of interculturalism, immigration, and so on and so forth, are the figures of what we have today, or what we call late capitalism? All those stuff that we have today is just, and I do not want to say it's a false focusing on them, and we ignored what we have literally fundamental for us to understand those things. I'm taking late capitalism as Frederick Jameson has theorized it. My second question is, I was literally expecting that you are going to use modernity as a concept in your presentation, but literally you didn't, and I wonder why. Why you did not use modernity when you are talking about reason? That modernity was the canon at the age of empire. So its intervention is based on temporality. So modernity always, promises us for something, that you are going to reach something. Even religion has the same rule. My last question is for Professor Salman, and literally I wonder, is that because you are a post-colonial scholar, that's why you have used space rather than temporality? Is space today a shift canon gives us as a third world, which are belong to the out of European American empire, gives us the possibility to see the periphery. And you have used literally a problematic word when you stated the grammatical or grammar, or see the word as grammar. Automatically, I remembered a French anthropologist and theologist, Michel de Certeau, the practice of everyday life. So he's really constructing something on how we consider space, and how we can turn and deturn, even in language. But as you know, the turn of language was, for example, for those who are using dialectic as a way of analysis, it was really abstract. So it does not give us the possibility to see the things in their dialectic. It's always, gives you just a barrier, if you want to say, a venue. You will not lead to any possibilities. You are just going through. So I don't know if I made sense or not. Thank you.
Thank you. This side, the sister right there.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this presentation. And Dr. Tihar Ramadan, a graduate from the University of Edinburgh. And my question is to Dr. Am. You mentioned Islamophobia as a virtual empire. And I think my understanding that you said that you are hoping that it is in the demise. What makes you think that Islamophobia is going actually to be listened for Muslims? Thank you.
Thank you. This side. Yes.
دكتور ياسر الطرشاني, Head of Department Fiqh and Usul Fiqh Malaysia, Ziyad Turkey. So it's a very, very important. Thank you so much about the presentation. I suggest to print this article because it's very, very important and show Guzel to show benefit about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, right there. Try to be brief so we can give the panelists the opportunity to respond. Second round, this is it.
Because I don't mind postponing my question to the second round because I think the panel is loaded with questions.
Yes, I get this is the last round. This is it. If you don't take it now, this is it.
Only one round.
If you don't ask your question now, it will not be asked.
Thank you for that clarification. This is to the panel. I come from Sri Lanka. My name is Mas Yusuf. We have experienced Islamophobic attacks in Sri Lanka. And Muslims are a minority in Sri Lanka. The question is, the Muslim community, looking inwards, they have an apologetic approach because they are minorities, or we are minorities. Now, my question is, what is your thought, what are your thoughts with regard to being apologetic in a minority context?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, last one back there.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Sayyid Azharuddin from India. My question is for Dr. Sayyid. Like you have spoke about Islamophobia with respect to geopolitics. You have mentioned about the China Uyghur Muslims as well as Myanmar Rohingya case. And in between these two places, there is a state of India called Assam, where 4 million people are stateless now, according to the reports of government as well as media reports, and majority may be the Muslim. So in this context, if you see, there are various hate crimes in India. In the same case of Sri Lanka and India, there in India also Muslims are minority. In this context that their population 1.3 billion, Muslims are minority. But if you compare to other countries, Muslims are 200 plus millions only in India. Still, Muslims are called minority there. And my question was specific to the geopolitics of the above China, there is a Uyghur problem, and in Rohingya. What about the Assam geography, the geopolitics of Assam especially?
Thank you. Any questions on this side? Back there?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm from Somaliland. And first of all, I want to thank you about the presentation. I have a simple question. It's about the social media especially. Why the social media website don't take the enough steps to stop the voice of hatred which attack the Muslims? We know the events which happen in the New Zealand and other other country. On the other hand, why we don't make our social media? Why we don't control our network? Like Russia, we know Russia now. It makes a system or own network. So the Muslim country can also make a network for this country, which is going to be some peaceful thing. The other thing is about...
Unfortunately, we don't have the heads of Twitter and Facebook with us today. Yes, go ahead.
The other, it is about a resistance. I think the words from Islamophobia is the resistance. Now in India, there is a lot of Muslim people who can't give their voice in the selection. And only the reason is they are Muslims. So the reason it's something is happened. And that's it.
Thank you. All right. Okay, last question.
I'd like to thank you both for your gorgeous presentations. It's been very enlightening. My question is for you, Professor Said. I have some friends in the UK, and they're telling me that the UK is employing a more Muslim-friendly policy towards them. But as I follow in the social media, that it's the opposite. But of course, the media creates illusions. So, as a person who experienced the academic and the social background of England and UK, can you call that the British policies employs Muslims as creators of catastrophe and terrorism and segregated communities? Do you think that they figure them more optimistic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to give each our speakers 5 minutes or so to respond. Perhaps you can also add this question to your list. You mentioned something about democracy and the accountability that democratic governments and societies have. Who's responsible? Whose responsibility is it when we have excesses in particular systems that define themselves as democratic? When we see these policies proliferating, basically adopting Islamophobic or anti-Muslim, not only rhetoric, but policies that affect lives, would it be the responsibility of governments, of elites, or of the whole society? What about those who didn't vote for these people? Do they also hold any responsibility? Are they accountable? And how do we define accountability? And perhaps Professor Said can address that as well. All right, so we got 5 minutes left to move.
I'll start because I had a question for Professor Said, but it's a question that I think links together some of your questions as well, and that is, and I also hope we'll be able to model conflict. It's that rather than seeing the Muslim as an obstacle to history or the ahistorical, which I believe is a recurrent trope, there's also, I think, even in this, an anxiety, and that's the anxiety of conversion, and so much of replacement, of capture. And so I think that behind the fear of the Muslim as this ahistorical figure is the fear of the Muslim as the future. And I find this fascinating, and in two ways. One, because of this doubling of the phenomenon, but also because I think the reaction to this, on the one hand, there's what you so I think aptly called white revanchism. This oh no, we could not be that. And then there is the other possibility. Well, that would be interesting. What would it be like? That is to say that there are two approaches to conflict. And in this respect, I think, in respect to conflict, the enemy and the friend are not oppositions. They are different approaches to the problem of conflict. That is to say, when you have a friend, as Nietzsche so aptly put it, you don't want a friend who is you. That's disgusting and boring and uninteresting. The friend gives you another world. The friend gives you surprises. Your friends are something that you could not have on your own, but which you have because they are not you. And that is fundamentally predicated on different and on conflicts. And yet, it is a way of being in the world which is profoundly rewarding. I think that people who understand a conflict as a problem, or that is a form of damage. That is what we have to combat. We have to combat this idea that when someone is radically different from you, they are a threat, rather than that is really interesting. And also, frankly, what can you make of it? You may not agree with all of it, but you may be able to make something of it. And it's that possibility that I want to build on. And it's also, this is something that I came to in part by reading Muslim philosophers. One of the things that fascinated me about Ibn Khaldun is that in the West, and especially in the United States, there's rugged individualism. And then there is collectivism. But what I love about Ibn Khaldun is, Ibn Khaldun says that people on the periphery, they have rugged individualism because they have to. But they also have solidarity with each other because they have to. And that linkage of those was so unexpected for me. But I thought that it was actually a better description of frontier places and precarious forms of life. So I think you can be provoked into this rethinking, which radically alters what you are. And you should want to radically alter what you are, unless you think you are absolutely perfect as you stand. And it's hard to imagine anyone, well, I have a president who's quite that narcissistic. You had so many excellent questions, some of which I cannot answer. I wanted to go to Junaid Ahmed's question, in part because I think it links Professor Syed and that is that question of how universals manifest themselves as particulars. And that, I think, really does describe Islamophobia as both of us significantly differently see it. That on the one hand, it is a recurrent phenomenon, this construction of the enemy. On the other hand, it's the particularity of it that is set by different historical occasions that appears differently in Sri Lanka, in India, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, but with a common linkage and capturing that the importance of both the universality and the particular is really enormously important. Social media, why don't we restrict it? I think there are two reasons. A trivial reason, which is we can't. Because we don't have Zuckerberg and all those other people who I regard as the enemy as present. But I also think that social media may be our enemy now, but it may be our friend in some context. That social media has been used for some remarkable things, and it's being used for some remarkable things, and for others, inshallah, in Algeria. So I wish them well, and it might be better for us to learn what we can do with social media. The final question is, of course, Professor Sami, and I am a radical Democrat. I am not a liberal Democrat. I am a radical Democrat. And by this, I mean a few things. I believe in popular sovereignty. I believe that the people should rule, and that the consent of the governed is the ground of legitimacy. And because I believe that, the responsibility is mine. That is to say, if something happens in my country or is done by my government, no matter how open I have been in my opposition, I still feel responsible for it, and I must feel responsible for it. And do what I can to respond to it. It's not enough to say, I voted for Hillary Clinton. That is to say, I'm still responsible, it is my duty. And in fact, there's this lovely moment in the Declaration where they say about rebellion, it is your right, it is your duty to rebel. And I think that understanding responsibility as a duty of resistance is quite important.
Great. Professor Sami. Thank you very much. There are so many questions, and I don't have the skill to weave them into one, nor do I have the ability to answer all of them, so forgive me if I miss anything out. But let me start with Professor Morton suggested about the question about friends and a world of friends. And in a way, I think it's absolutely correct that I think I don't have anything to disagree with. The only thing is this, that you can't have friends without the existence of enemies. I mean, that's the point that it seems to me that if we all know people who are friends with everybody, and you kind of think, I'm not sure your friendship means that much if you're friends with everybody. And that's the point in the sense there, right? So there's a certain kind of, I want my friend to be only my friend. It's not just jealousy, it's actually, I don't value that their friendship means anything, if it's simply for everybody. So I think the idea we can't have friends without enemies, but the question I think Professor Mills is absolutely right, is that these don't have to be static positions. You can see the kind of mobility, that we may agree on some things, that we may friendship in some areas and disagreement in others, and vice versa. So that's the first kind of point. And I think in a way what that relates to is, in my first book, I talked about the decentering of the West as being a condition of possibility for the articulation of Islamism. And by what I meant by the decentering of the West was really the sense in which the belief in the future westernization of the world has, for a variety of reasons, become challenged in a very fundamental way. And one can examine that through many kind of phenomena. But that, in a sense, if disarticulates the relationship between the universal and the sense of the West. This is why much of the effort since then is to try and stitch these things together again. And in a way, Islamophobia is simply one aspect of putting those, trying one strategy to put those together. And the reason why I think it started fixing upon the Muslim goes back to the point that I've made before about the Muslim as being constitutive and as a reminder of the contingency of the European enterprise. So that's one kind of element of that. I think the element around Sri Lanka and the minorities and apologizing, and what should we people do? I don't think it's apology is not a condition of, I don't think in the case that you're talking about is a condition of just being minorities. I think this kind of apologetic discourse is really arises from the notion, and this is where Ibn Khaldun's kind of very acute observation, that the defeated actually internalize the conditions of the defeat. They internalize the condition, and they think the reason why they were defeated is because the victor or the winner is superior to them. And that then becomes an attempt to try and deal with it. So I think that kind of apologetics is really quite fundamental. Many, many Muslims, and not just in Sri Lanka, in many, many Muslim majority countries, in many other kinds of world, will start off by saying, you know what the real problem with Islamophobia is the Muslims. They are the cause of Islamophobia. And I think it's both morally repugnant, but forget about morality for a minute. I think it's politically dangerous to start with that assumption in a way. There is no excuse to what happened to the Rohingya, what has happened to the Uyghurs, there's absolutely no excuse. And if we start at that road, then there's nowhere to go. You know. So that I think is, I would put there. I think the question about democracy is really, really important, and I think it's interesting. I mean, the two things I would say about this. Democracy is compatible with racism and imperialism. That's the first thing. So the idea that people have that the notion of democracy itself is somehow insulation from those things, I think is very difficult to sustain. Democracy is compatible with genocide. On the end is how you constitute the demos. And that, I think, is the key feature here. And I think this is why Professor Norton's earlier kind of thing about, and I wanted to ask her really how she would distinguish between empires and non-empires, because in a way you could argue what is distinctive about empires rather than, let's say, other forms of state, is precisely that at least empires, they have many negatives. But what positives sometimes they have, if they're not racialized, is the ability to constitute through a sabiyya, actually an larger sense of citizen belonging. That their notion of the demos doesn't have to be exclusionary in the same kind of way. And I think that's kind of interesting, and I think it's worth making a difference between colonial racial empires and non-colonial racial empires. Not all empires are the same empires, for example. I think the final point that I would want to make, and really it comes down to the way that we're thinking about Islamophobia and what role it plays in the world. Let's agree on this. When the Runnymede Report was published in 1997, which reintroduced Islamophobia into Western public discourse, it was completely concerned with Muslim minority conditions in Britain. That was its remit. And in the pages of that report, it said that, you know what, Muslims shouldn't try and get involved in things outside Britain because that just causes Islamophobia. Since then, Islamophobia has become global. And what we have to recognize is that in that globality, Islamophobia is no longer simply an affair of the interior. As a consequence, to reduce it to simply how you manage minorities or manage difference takes away the radical challenge it poses. Because even at the most basic level, one of the things about Islamophobia is the securitization of cultural and social cohesion, for example. That itself is, those two spheres which were kept separate for a long time have become conflated. And in that, the key moment, and I think this one, the key moment of democracy is the notion of the citizen. And the issue now is that, can a Muslim be a citizen? Because not only empirically, because we have seen the erosion of citizenship for Muslim rights, including, for example, the ability to president to attack and kill a Muslim American citizen. But generally, you have in Britain the idea that if some citizens can have their citizenship taken away, and they are nearly almost all Muslims that happen to them. But once you start having the idea that Muslims, because they cannot be contained in the bounds of the nation state, they can't really be citizens, that, it seems to me, is really where the fulcrum is. Because without the citizen, the security of the citizen, the idea of a radical democracy or any form of open and, I'll say progressive because I'm getting tired now, formulation of citizenship requires a citizen that has rights which cannot be stripped away by governments. Or that, I think, is, without that, you cannot have democracy in any shape, way, or form. And the final point I would say to you is this, that I don't know whether democracy is possible globally. And the reason is this, because the hegemonic articulations of democracy simply see democracy as inseparable from westernization. And what I mean by this, think for a minute. If you can imagine a country which is considered to be anti-Western, not non-Western, anti-Western, and democratic at the same time. I've asked this question many times in Istanbul. I have yet to receive an example of that. And I think that shows that the challenge. Because perhaps what we should be talking about when we talk about demos is simply a particular tradition which has one word for good governance, and other historical traditions may have other words for good governance. And whether one wants to change with them and call them this or that, that's an open-ended question. But the real possibility is that there may be different ways of generating ideas about good governance throughout the history of humanity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for both our panelists and also to Dr. Argun, Dr. Norton, Dr. Said for this wonderful, enlightening presentations. We really started off, I think, very, very strong in this conference. Before we give the awards to our presenters, I just want to remind everybody about tomorrow. Tomorrow we do start at 9:30 in the morning, so I hope we'll fill the hall here. The first session tomorrow, which is session 2, will be about the intellectual and political mainstreaming of Islamophobia, the role of elites, think tanks, and right-wing groups. So we will be discussing the far-right groups. We will have Dr. Farid Hafiz from the University of Salzburg, Dr. Al-Arian from Long Island University, and Dr. Osama Al-Azami from the UK. And then we'll have the second presentation on Islamophobia in the service of empire. So I hope to see all of you tomorrow. And now I'd like to present
Murthy.
Thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow morning.